Hi, welcome to the Classicist Corner, and let's talk about 1950s Orphee. Orphee is a contemporary retelling of the myth of Orpheus, set in post-occupational 1950s France. It was written and directed by French playwright, philosopher and filmmaker Jean Cocteau, who was very interested in the myth of Orpheus itself. Now, the myth of Orpheus is one you probably already know. It's of the great poet and musician Orpheus, who was so fantastic at his trade, at playing music and singing his poems, that it would grow trees from the earth itself and tame the greatest of beasts. Now, Orpheus was very much in love with his wife Eurydice, so when she was bitten by a snake and died, he refused to accept it. He went into the underworld itself and demanded that Hades release her, singing a poem for him. Now, Hades, being so moved by this, let Eurydice go, but on the condition that she follow Orpheus out, and if Orpheus looked back, he would lose her forever. Now, being a Greek hero and getting advice, he ignored it and looked back at the last second, losing her. Now, this myth can be found in quite a few places, most prominently in Virgil's Georgics, book 4, and Ovid's Metamorphoses, books 10 and 11. It also has references in Euripides' Alcestis, and there are some mentions in Plato's Symposium. Now, the myth of Orpheus is very interesting for a lot of reasons, but quite significantly, it is an example of a catabasis, literally going down into the underworld. And lots of heroes have catabasis. It's actually very common. I mean, apart from Orpheus, there is Theseus, Heracles, Odysseus, Aeneas. Lots of them go down into the underworld. And that is a feature that features very prominently in Orphee. In the beginning of the film, Orphee opens with a quick retelling of the myth of Orpheus. Then there is a quote stating that "It is the privilege of all legend to be timeless, as you like it." And that really does set the stage for the film. This isn't Orpheus in ancient Greece. This is Orpheus in France. This is Orpheus in post-occupational France. And it really does work in that setting. There is a great contrast between life and death, and between the relationship of poetry and art and death, which I think France is a great setting for. Jean Cocteau was a fantastic filmmaker, and he was a fantastic writer, and he had a way of capturing light and dark. The film's in black and white, and the shadows and light really capture the tone of the film. In some ways, Orphee is a very good example of a catabasis. Not only the literal catabasis which goes on in the film, e.g. Orpheus going to the underworld or going to the place of death, but it's a fantastic example of artistic catabasis. There is a very strong relationship within the film about art, poetry, love and death. They all intermingle. And the film has a very good way of portraying this visually, not only with the black and white and the shadows produced in the film, but in the very characters themselves. Orpheus in Orphee is not quite like his ancient Greek counterpart. Orpheus is not the young poet who has newly found his greatest love and can sing the birds from the trees. Orpheus in Orphee is, let's just say he's a little bit older and a little bit jaded. In Orphee, Orpheus is already a renowned poet, famed throughout France, presumably, as he is called a national treasure. However, with his fame seems to have come the death of his art, and he is too famous, too well known. And so it's sort of an example of being the sellout, or at least that's the impression I got. In the beginning of the film, set in a Café des Poètes, he is derided by the rest of the people, and there is a sense that he is even though he is a renowned poet, he is deeply unpopular with the people in his community. Especially because they seem to have moved on. They seem to have been enamoured by the newest model. A fantastic, if drunk, and according to Orpheus, rather tasteless young man called Suggest, who seems to write nothing but still be famous, as shown in his magazine Nudism. Orpheus' poetry has lived and has now somewhat died to be replaced by the younger model, which, by the way, it's quite bad that Orpheus is portrayed by Jean Marais, again sorry for the awful French pronunciation, who was a former lover of Jean Cocteau. Now, Jean Suggest was played by Cocteau's then current lover, literally trading the old for the new there. Yes. So there is a lot of tension with Orpheus, but Orpheus finds that he is inspired by death itself. Now, death in the film is portrayed wonderfully as the princess, a foreigner in France who is yet fascinated by the French poets, initially seen taking an interest in the young Suggest. Now, the princess is death herself, and it's fascinating that this is one of the few examples of death being portrayed as a woman, being acted wonderfully by Maria Sara. I think that's how you say her name. And she is a wonderfully poised and powerful, literal femme fatale. And Orpheus is initially enamoured by her after she drags him, well, not really drags, after she coerces him into her car to try and look after the then dead Suggest after her interference. And Orpheus's relationship with death is very passionate, as he loves her, as in literally is in love with, romantically and indeed sexually, with death, and indeed she is also in love with him. There is an implication that she is enamoured with poets in general. However, this is quite complicated due to his marriage to Eurydice. Now, in the original myth, Orpheus was extremely dedicated to Eurydice. He loved her with a burning passion and loved her so much that after he died, he swore off women forever. In this film, however, he seems rather bored with her, as he represents normal life, domestic, regular life that a dramatic poet like Orpheus seems to resent in his quest for his art. And all Eurydice wants is to have her husband, to have her loving husband, and to have a family with him. Now, before I continue, I have to talk about the character of Euripides, who is the ghostly driver of death. He drives her wonderful car, and he watches Orpheus and falls in love with Eurydice. Some could say there is no real reference to him in ancient mythology, but I find Euripides to be a very mercurial character, and I do mean that literally. To me, he seems to represent Hermes, who was not only the god of messengers and thieves and roads and guests and all of that, but he was also a psychopomp. He literally led the spirits of the dead down to the underworld. And in this case, he also leads the spirit of Orpheus to the underworld after Eurydice dies. Now, Eurydice dies seemingly because Orpheus doesn't pay attention to her, unlike in the myth where it is a merely freak accident where she's bitten by a snake. She dies because in Orphee, she dies because she must get away from the situation which her husband has placed her in. He obsessively tries to write new poems, or rather listen to poems on my car radio. She goes to see her friends, and on the way she is cut down by Death's riders. Back from death. Okay, Like in the myth, Orpheus tries to go get Eurydice back from the underworld. However, there is quite an important question by Hermes here, who is leading Orpheus there, asking, are you going for Eurydice, or are you going for death itself? And Orpheus answers, both. He is enamoured with death, and even though he feels regretful that his wife has died, he still can't quite get that love, that sensational lust for death out of his system, especially his poetic system. In many of Jean Cocteau's work, he had a fascination with death and mirrors, saying, roughly translated into, if you look within the mirror, you can see death pass you by. For example, you will see yourself age. If you look in a mirror, slowly you will see yourself die. And he was quite obsessed with that imagery. And indeed, to get to the underworld in the world of Orphee, you go through a mirror, which it's beautifully shot. There's a fantastic element of slipping into these worlds through a mirror. And the portrayal, and there's wonderful shot, actually, quickly, there's wonderful shots in this film where the use of visuals is rather fantastic, where you can tell how they did certain visual tricks, like to enter the underworld you have to wear special gloves, and the way they put them on, it's kind of, they do it backwards. They reverse the film of you putting on gloves, and it's so quick, but it looks so weird, and it's fantastic. And especially when death, to take bodies into the underworld, the princess of death, yeah, not princess of death, the princess who is death, kind of raises them up again, and it's literally just they just replay footage, they just reverse footage of people falling and then getting back up, and it looks so simple, but it's very effective. Anyway, enough about that. So you enter the underworld through death. So you enter the underworld through mirrors. And the underworld in Orphee is portrayed as sort of a ruined, almost bombed out city, which must have been very significant imagery for a country, for France just after World War II. And there's this wonderful air of power and desolation about it. To me, the underworld in Orphee is almost specifically Roman. The panel of three judges who judge Death as a character for illegally taking Eurydice's life, saying that it wasn't her time, and looking over that. And they do indeed question whether Death has done that for the selfish reason of being in love with Orpheus. And she answers yes. They do find that Eurydice's death was illegal, and she is indeed returned to life. However, like in the myth, with a caveat that Orpheus may never look at her. Now that's actually quite different for the myth, I find, because in the myth, Orpheus could only not look at Eurydice while leaving the underworld. However, in this story, he can never look at her ever. He will promise never to look at her again, which to me seems rather convenient. He no longer feels the guilt of being the cause of his wife's death, but he no longer really has to deal with her. There is an element of this film often found in later myths of Orpheus, specifically in Ovid, in which describes Orpheus's death. Now, in Ovid, Orpheus dies because he rejects the advances of women. As I said previously, after Eurydice dies in myth, he rejects the advances of women, deciding to take male lovers instead. However, a group of Bacchantes fall in love with his music and with him, and he rejects them, and then they tear him apart. However, in Orphee, Orpheus is shot by a mob who blame him for the death of Segest. They think he plagiarised his work, took it for his own, and killed him. After being accused of killing another poet, he dies and is with Death again, is with the princess. Now, I find it very interesting that Jean Cocteau loved the myth of Orpheus so much. Cocteau himself was often criticised by the artistic and filmmaking community in France at the time for being a sellout, for being too simplistic and commercial with his films. So I think he could probably understand the elements of being too popular, being too commercial for his social peers, in which Orpheus experiences in the film. I also find it quite significant that the openly homosexual Jean Cocteau was quite a fan of Orpheus, the man who rejected women, and was ultimately killed for it. So many elements in which I could talk about Orphee, and I could probably talk about it for a long time. There are so many symbolic and intertextual things which come along with this film, and it's absolutely fantastic. And it's one of the few DVDs I've ever gotten that came with an educational booklet. It's really fantastic. So I would recommend this film wholeheartedly. Its artistry is fantastic. It has beautiful cinematography, and the use of light and shadows is just wonderful. I will see you all next time for another story for the myth of Orpheus. Okay, bye guys, I'm out.